You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. My guest is Stephanie Schnorr. She's a postdoctoral fellow at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And we're going to be talking about human diet and digestion and gut microbiome in the framework of human evolution, which sounds super interesting. So, Stephanie, thanks for coming.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so it sounds like, I guess, somewhat of an unusual topic. How did you get interested in, what people have eaten throughout, thousands or hundreds of years?
Yeah, combine those two. So it's hundreds of thousands of years that I'm most interested in. But it's a bit of a backstory. But formally, I've had all of my education in anthropology. So I've always been interested in the study of human evolution and specifically biological anthropology. So the biological underpinnings of what makes us human. And I guess I was originally kind of coming into my graduate work thinking about sports performance and how to optimize the function of human body in sports. And that led me to thinking about neuromuscular function, metabolism, energy needs, nutritional needs. And then I sort of stepped back and remembered my training from college and thought about, okay, well, there's obviously evolutionary underpinnings to all of this, and then kind of stepping back a little bit further from that and really thinking, okay, well, what is actually needed, what's necessary in order to fuel and sustain an entire human organism? So that obviously led me to thinking about the diet and human evolution. And so I was really fortunate that I was able to start a graduate student dissertation work looking at exactly that. What is kind of our sort of alternatives to not just our alternatives to meat in human evolution, but looking at the plant foods in human evolution, which I found to be very enticing as a research subject because it's not often talked about, and plants have a lot of very interesting nutritional components that we need. And from there, I kind of fell into thinking about how are we actually obtaining this nutrition with our very kind of restricted, simplified digestive system. So our gut is very unspecialized and simple. And then that launched me into this entire investigation on the human gut microbiome, because I thought, well, okay, we know a lot about what's going on from mouth to small intestine, but what happens in the colon and what its contribution is to human health had not really been well explored at this time. This was around 2010, 2011. So that made me think, well, obviously we need to start talking about what could be the contribution of gut microbiome and colonic fermentation in sort of the sum of nutritional acquisition for humans.
So what does science know about what people have been eating for hundreds of thousands of years? Does it know a lot? Are there huge gaps? Does it know very little? You look over history, what do we know?
Yeah, it's kind of all of those at once. We know a lot, but there's obviously a lot to know. So there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and it's impossible to know everything. We have very good records from bones and stones, the tools that preserve through millions of years. And but what's missing is the record of plants. And so we tend to have this narrative that our early kind of Australopithecine, so once the human lineage split off from our great ape cousins, we have this narrative that we started to increasingly incorporate meat into the diet. And to some extent, that's true. And certainly humans became very capable hunters at some point, or humans, or possibly, a human ancestor. But we don't really have a good record of what was filling in the gaps in between these meat meals, these kills that must have been extremely valuable, but also fairly sporadic, and possibly early on very hard to obtain and opportunistic, only in the sense that perhaps humans could only scavenge what was left over by prime predators, such as different cats that were living during this time. So we do have very good information from existing hunter-gatherers, and learning from them, we've kind of been able to tease back or sort of pull back the veil of time a bit and say, okay, here's what's going on in a modern kind of context in a hunting and gathering society, and here we see what are the values and what is the contribution of different foods in their diet. And so we can say, okay, this was likely, there was likely a similar situation in that humans needed to obtain some form of starch in their diet, such as from tubers, underground storage organs. This tends to be the potatoes part of the meat and potatoes, if you reduce it down to that kind of simplistic dichotomy. But also so different forms of starch or different forms of plant carbohydrates, and especially very difficult to digest polysaccharides. One example I can give that's really intriguing is that North American hunter-gatherers, so basically the early Native Americans, sustained in large part on different underground storage organs that were comprised of inulin. And inulin is a carbohydrate that cannot be broken down by the human digestive system. And so it requires long duration cooking to slowly break down these long chains of what are ultimately fructose sugars linked together. And so we just have this diversity of plants and their nutritional components in our diet that you can find temporally across time, and you can find in present day context, or even in very recent living memory or history and historical context. And you can see that there's just this array of nutritional elements, that there's no one kind of simple diet that we can pin down and say this is human diet. But what we do know is that human diet is extremely varied, and it tends to have a predominance, at least 50% of plant food contribution.
So it seems like humans were opportunistic. If you were Inuit or Eskimo, and there's not much up there except seals and whales and things like that, you ate that. And then if you lived in the tropics, you probably ate plants most of the time, and an animal occasionally, right?
Right. Yeah, I would 100% agree that humans are really the prime opportunists, and it's really demonstrated by the fact that we've been able to occupy just about every ecology across the globe, including extreme polar and Arctic locations, and then also in the tropics, and also in marine or aquatic, where aquatic resources are the dominant resource, and that we are just able to adapt our environment to meet our needs.
And I guess that also supports our digestive system being simple, and what's interchangeable, I guess, is the set of gut bacteria that allows us to digest whatever we happen to be eating or changing to eating over time. So,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you've really kind of pinpointed what I'd say is a major hypothesis of mine going into this work. So kind of what kicked it off is I thought, I want to look at the physiology of the gut, and because through looking at that, I want to try to understand how has evolution shaped humans, and therefore what are we specialized to do, to eat, and actually almost the exact opposite kind of revelation through my studying this was that, oh, actually we tend to lose a lot of these specializations as we proceed through time along the human lineage, and we seem to be less and less specialized, which is actually what our specialization is that we have no specialization, that we are very malleable, very adaptable. And so, yeah, that kind of brought me to this idea that maybe the gut microbiome is a way that we can kind of leverage nuance and rapid mutation, evolution, and change, but at the microbial scale and at the microbial ecological scale. And that perhaps these communities of microorganisms that live inside of us can provide things that we have lost perhaps in the course of evolution or just that we never had to begin with, such as the ability to metabolize different very refractory or difficult to digest carbohydrates that tend to be in a generalized primate diet. So, and humans are no exception to that.
Well, from what I learned, I mean, it starts with with birth. Like in a vaginal birth, the baby's bathed in the mother's microbiome, and then in breast milk, there's like different oligosaccharides that we can't digest, but attracts certain bacteria to take up residence in a baby's gut. So it's from the very beginning, we need our microbiome to help us start digesting stuff.
Yeah, certainly, and we know that when there's some sort of deviation or malfunction, we see this in organisms that are specifically bred to be sterile and to have no microbiome. That what comes with that is kind of an array or a panoply of problems that from malfunctioning of the immune system and malfunctioning of the metabolic activity in the body. And so, yeah, you're exactly right. Sounds like you've done your research on this. That early seeding of the microbiome seems to have profound long-term implications of an individual's health, or at least susceptibility to disease. But what's really interesting and also I guess kind of a relief to hear is that it's not a completely deterministic process, and that say if somebody was born by cesarean section, which anecdotally and personally I was a C-section baby, it doesn't mean that you are destined to have a lifetime of predisposition to diseases or chronic illness. And so what's really kind of rewarding, I guess, in pursuit of this kind of research is that we can understand how, in spite of all of our tinkering in nature and all of our technological kind of process or progress, we can still overcome, or we can still sort of rebuild what we seem to have lost or what we seem to be missing by skipping over what nature sort of built for us as far as natural birth and breastfeeding. And so it's not necessarily a downward spiral if you happen to be born by cesarean section, or if you happen to have been bottle fed. So it seems to be a very fluid kind of ecological system.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've thought of, what are you doing if you're eating the same limited diet all the time versus eating a very diverse diet? The more diverse you eat, the more diverse bacteria that will probably take up residence within you. And what does that do for you? Does that diversity help your immunity to other pathogens? Does it, I don't know. I mean, what does it do to your ability to digest foods? And, does it compromise what you were eating before? Does it make it better? Does it, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess you can study populations of people. Some are very diverse eaters. Some are very narrow eaters. So today, contemporarily, there's all these groups that could be looked at for info.
Yeah, sure. And everything you're asking are kind of open questions. And there is a lot of focus on diversity and its meaning, and whether or not we ultimately should strive for diversity above all else. And when you ask about diversity of diet and kind of infer this, that a higher diversity of food confers higher diversity in the gut microbiome, but really matters what you mean by diversity and whether or not you're talking about diversity of the types of foods that you're eating, or the diversity of the nutrients of those foods. And so myself and many others argue that it's the diversity of the particular nutrients of those foods. So you may be eating, what you would consider a very diverse diet, at least in our kind of modern Western industrial agricultural sort of setting that we're in. However, most of those foods have been genetically engineered in some form to provide us with nutrients that we desire the most. And so we have sort of engineered all of our crops to supply us with very digestible and often mainly macronutrient type of nutrients rather than all of these other micronutrients that we need, micronutrients that are much more heavily provided in wild types of these plants, and also in the form of the polysaccharides. So again, the carbohydrates, the sugar-based polymers of that are the structural components and also the macronutrient components of these plants. So when you talk about diversity and wanting to make this kind of one-to-one association between diversity of the diet and diversity in the microbiome, I think it's really important to establish that we're really talking about the diversity of the nutrients themselves rather than the diversity of the types of foods.
Well, a lot of people don't even have diversity in the type of processed food they're eating, much less diversity in raw food or wild caught, or so there's two levels.
Almost by definition, processed food is the absence of diversity. Processed food is the absence of anything that's kind of nuanced. It's entirely refined, processed, simple to digest, sugar, fat, protein for the most part, but mainly sugar and fat. And sure, diets that are comprised of whole foods can still be simple diets in terms of they may just be cellulose, water, and starch. And so, it really may be somewhat counterintuitive. What is actually diverse in terms of diversifying your microbiome?
Well, I can hear that you like to think about things. So, what do you imagine would happen if you strive to eat a lot of raw, wild-caught stuff, local honey and local this and that, and different plants from different regions, and you try to have like a really diverse diet. What do you think would happen first with your microbiome, and how would that change your physiology or way of living? What do you postulate would happen? And what do you postulate what happens with the opposite, with someone that eats like McDonald's and restaurant food and just processed garbage all the time, and that's all they eat? If you compare the two, what do you think the differences would be?
But I think those are almost incomparable. I think it would be really important or really relevant to actually compare somebody who, like you say, might be foraging in their local environment for wild foods versus somebody who may be eating something what we would consider a healthy kind of typical diet, like a Mediterranean diet. So let's just try and keep things a little bit simple and just maybe change the source of the food, but we're still talking about maybe prescribed healthy diet, and one that both diets may confer, your sort of daily recommended amounts of fiber and vitamins and minerals and so on. But I think what would really be kind of the important distinction here is that somebody that would be foraging wild plants or wild foods is having this interaction with the environment that somebody that is just your average whole foods, grocery store forager will be missing out on. And so the store-bought food tends to be obviously a product of modern agriculture, and it's also highly sterile. And so the person who is able to forage for their food would be coming into contact with the panoply of microorganisms that live in the environment, soil, and that includes not just bacteria, but yeast and fungi and eukaryotes, and then from there, it just kind of scales up depending on maybe where their drinking water is coming from. Like you're talking about really just an embodiment of environmental microorganisms. And I mean, other than saying that this is, I think, certainly going to lead to an increased diversity of the microbiome, possibly also an increased diversity of the amount of intestinal discomforts you're going to receive in the process. I mean, I think already there's going to be a stark contrast in the physiological differences or manifestations, at least in the microbiome, between these two particular examples. And when you go from there to somebody who's just eating a refined diet, as you say, somebody that's just eating McDonald's every day, then you're going to see an extremely scaled down microbiome. As in, I've looked at some gut microbiomes from people who have exactly this kind of diet, and it's stark how few representative species or taxa that you actually see, and how little change there must be in order to kind of bolster that number to kind of a more respectable ecosystem. So while it doesn't take very much, push to kind of help seed the system, there is certainly a huge range of variation that we see in present day diet.
Yeah, my theory is that it would bolster your immune system to have, maybe not all the time, but at least often, different kinds of foods, plants, etc., because you'd have a much larger diversity of microbiome in you. And that is, to me, that's information. These microbes are capable of taking different substances and processing them and, doing things with them. And then let's say you're going to get sick or you're exposed to a pathogen. I would think your microbiome would be more likely to identify it and maybe guard against it from infecting you, because if there's more different microbes there's more, I'm going to call it intelligence on what to do. It's not so foreign because there's so many different microbes in there, again, processing your food. And, they're all, what do you call it? I guess it's mutualistic. They're all there to work for you and for themselves. So they're all our partners. So the more we have of them, the more different talents we have, the healthier I think we'll stay. This is just my theory.
Yeah, no, I like that you've led into this with the idea of information, that this is a process of information acquisition. I think that's a really great analogy to make, and I agree entirely. I think there's some things I could sort of, I'll just sort of needle in there with maybe a bit of tweaking on your hypothesis. So first of all, for someone consuming a much more complex diet that may be conferring all of this microbial diversity, we're not yet certain how that translates into actual immune health and actual immune robusticity. And this is going to definitely differ person to person depending on that person's individual life history. What was their sort of their developmental history? Do they have susceptibility to other diseases? Are they actually living with some sort of chronic disease? But by and large, most people also have some form of intestinal barrier dysfunction and disruption. And I'm talking about almost anybody almost everybody to some degree has some kind of allergy or reaction to something in the environment, which means that there is a inflammatory or reactive occurrence happening at the mucosal barrier between you and the environment. And this is some sort of reaction of your immune system to some kind of breach, between you and the environment. And this seems to be rapidly increasing in our society, at least, probably by from a myriad of factors, such as sanitation and the types of foods that we eat, the amount of stress that we have, the lack of sleep, antibiotics, pesticides, you name it. So I would first just caution about how much we actually know, about diversity and changes in the microbiome and health improvements or improvements in the immune system. I think consuming a more nutritious diet is going to obviously confer more nutrients to you directly, not just from, microbial activity on these nutrients, but actually in your primary digestive system. So you're actually going to be receiving more minerals, more vitamins. So this is going to make you healthier. This is going to fortify your immune system, your body, enable it to react much more smoothly to whatever the seasonal allergen may be, or whatever the particular flu or pathogen that's running around. So there's kind of caveat number one. Number two, as far as, let's see, what you were saying was, you think there'd be much more information exchange, and therefore we'd be able to train the immune system better by having diversity of microbiota, and that they're commensal in working for us. But as far as their commensality, their mutualism, again, so mutualism is not an automatic trait of the microbiome. It can be mutualistic to some degree, but by and large, it's symbiotic or merely commensal, in that it lives with us and inside of us, and it needs us and we need it. But it's always a push-pull kind of relationship. We are always having, our immune system is there to keep this microbial community in line. Once our immune system goes away, as in once we die, the microbes take over. So there is a sort of tension between the two. We live with each other, we support each other, we avail common goods in the form of nutrients and an environment for them to live and be happy and thrive. We also exert pressure so that we can kind of dictate the kinds of communities that we would want to have, the ones that are producing things that are good for us or beneficial or signaling for us. And they do the same. They kind of exert their own systemic pressures in the environment that they live in, so that they can sort of control the other types of species that are living around them. They can control maybe fluidity of the environment or acidity and these kinds of parameters. And sometimes they can get out of whack, and sometimes they're not entirely good for us. And you can experience this, at any given time. If you've eaten something that you'd say it didn't agree with you, gives you indigestion, you immediately feel this kind of perturbation going on. Maybe, maybe we're just getting a little bit too nitty gritty here, but you sense that there is a change inside of you, and this change can be actually rapidly assessed. So if you just had a stool sample from pre-meal and then post-meal, you could probably pick this up almost immediately in the fluctuation of the taxonomic representation. So, just to conclude, I would just say that there's not this one-to-one association. We don't know what diversity really means. We don't know that, we can't say that all of these microbial members are exactly our friends and imparting good things that we want them to impart to us.
Well, here's kind of a mind bender. So if you think about the digestive system, we have a microbiome of the mouth. We probably have a different microbiome of the esophagus, is my guess. Then in the stomach, it's so acidic. I mean, maybe there are creatures that live there, maybe not. I don't know. They probably are. Then the small intestine, then the large intestine. So if I'm a microbe that hangs out in the large intestine, what's my relationship with the microbes that are in front of me, the small intestine? Do I communicate with them, and depending on what they do, I get different nutrients? What about the mouth? Does the mouth microbiome communicate with, the intestine, because they're quote unquote processing first or eating first? So is there a hierarchy of bacteria and other, creatures that as you go through the digestive system, and what's that communication look like?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And again, it's something that there's kind of a black box in the middle of that, because a lot of these sites are so hard to sample, especially on a living person, and so invasive. So from about the early phase of the colon, and then up through the small intestine, this is nearly just entirely dark matter to us. But yeah, I think you're really, again, you're onto something about this chain of command, or this sort of chain of information flow from mouth to anus. So there's a starting point and then there's an end point. In between, there's a lot of interaction going on, depending on who has interacted with these substrates first and what they've produced. We do know that in animals that have different, very specified regions of the colon, there are such as hindgut fermenters. They may have sacculated colons that actually in different regions within the large intestine, they have different communities of microbes that perform very different functions. And to probably a lesser degree, this is also true for humans and for other omnivores. So I would say it's very likely that you would have different populations. If you could even call it a microbiome in something in the esophagus and the stomach, I'm not so sure, but certainly there's going to be microorganisms that are there. As to the degree and relevance of their function, it's really hard to say, and I would postulate that it's possibly not so relevant in terms of our sort of overall function and overall what's being produced from what we're consuming. Certainly in the mouse, there's a lot of activity, but my hypothesis or my intuition would be that if anything is really living in a community sense in esophagus or in the stomach, these would really sort of be there as a kind of environmental keepers, as in maintaining a kind of status quo of the environment or aiding in doing so, or maybe just living and getting by. But I think where microbial activity really comes into play would be in the mouth, and then probably parts of the small intestine, and of course into the colon. As for how much these groups communicate with each other, well, there's increasing evidence that the environment of the mouth does have connections with all kinds of sort of systemic environments and systems, such as even the vascular system. And so we're actually seeing connections between atherosclerosis in the mouth, atherosclerosis of the arterial system, and periodontitis in the mouth, so gum disease. Whether or not there's a direct correlation between microbes that are part of gum disease and the buildup of plaque in your vascular tissue kind of remains to be seen, but certainly there's some sort of connection between the inflammatory processes that are at play here. So I wouldn't say quite that this is a hierarchy, but certainly there is a chain of command, or there is a chain that is, I would assume, is sort of mediated by the sort of systemic activity and environment of the body. And so the body, I think, is really regulating for the connection between these groups of microorganisms and kind of relaying what's happening in one place to what ultimately happens in another place, and obviously bringing the kind of metabolites or the products of microbial activity and transferring them around to different environments that then play into how the next set of microorganisms are going to react and what their metabolism will look like. I guess overall, it's such a great question, but it's so much. There's so much that we don't know about how these all interface together and what it means for our health overall.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. I mean, I guess I won't go crazy and ask you all of them, but I guess there's one more. So,
okay.
A given person has their immune system, which has a memory. It knows what has gone before to some extent, what it's been attacked by before, and it has its own microbiome at that point. So when a new bacteria or virus enters the organism, who is vetting that thing to see whether it's friend or foe, and who's involved in that decision? Is it, obviously the immune system, but what about the microbiome itself? If you have 5,000 different kinds of bacteria in you and 12,000 different kinds of viruses, and a new one comes along, how do you know if it's friend or foe? And again, who's sitting on the council, vetting this thing? I would think it's cooperative between, the immune system and the microbiome. There's communication there is my bet to say, what do we do with this thing that's here? Welcome it or kill it?
Right. That's funny. So they form, yeah, sure. Our microbial systems and our immune system may form the Great Council to evaluate any kind of newcomers. And it most certainly would depend on how this newcomer has entered the body. Who's going to interface with it first. If it's some sort of blood pathogen, then the immune system is going to be on it right away. If it's something that's entering from airways or from food or from water sources, then most likely we're going to have some sort of first pass, kind of assessment from the microbial community. And this is where diversity really comes into play. I think that is where it's really important, because I think when you have these microbial communities kind of working in a very dynamic system with a lot of kind of feedback and a lot of interaction, then they also work together to exclude and can have a lot of different ways and systems to actually assess or sense an intruder, a foreign intruder that may be pathogenic. Yeah, so exactly what you're saying. I think there's a sort of two-way interface here of the microbiome gets to assess an intruder and certainly the immune system. But I think if it's something like a foodborne pathogen, then we ultimately want our microbiome to deal with it, because once it starts to interfere with our own immune system, that's when we get sick, and that's when we have the more extreme reactions and the extreme discomfort that comes with having some sort of, what we say as a stomach bug.
Right.
So, ultimately, I think it's better if we can just leverage the activity of microbial systems that are within us to kind of help shelter us, help, keep out all the bad guys.
So what questions are you looking at right now in your research? What do you hope to answer in the next year or two?
Oh my gosh. So actually my research is quite diverse, and I only really stumbled into microbiome research in the beginning of my PhD, and I dabbled in it a bit there. I went on to do a postdoc at the University of Oklahoma, where I was really getting much more into the study of microbiomes, and specifically in ancient microbiomes. And I'm also doing projects looking at actual human genetic variability and the adaptations to human diet itself. That doesn't include a microbial component. So I have a lot of kind of future areas of interest that I'm working in. But one thing that I've been really curious about and wanting to kind of follow up on is exploring networks of gene functions in different microbiomes to understand if there's any kind of patterns that may emerge for humans especially, but also even for terrestrial animals with complex brains. And I'm really interested in how we have come to develop this complex brain and enables this complex cognition that we have. And there are obviously other examples of animals with large brains as well, our great ape cousins, and dolphins, whales, of course, elephants. But what's really interesting to me is the terrestrial component, meaning that we're removed from this rich watery resource, the ocean system, that can confer pretty much all of the underpinnings of life. And so once you're on a terrestrial ecosystem, you have a bit more limitation in the kinds of structural and nutritional resources that are at play. And so I really want to look into microbiomes as potentially a way of compensating for anything that may be missing in the terrestrial food web. And so I did a temporary postdoc fellowship where I was looking at different gene functions and pathways, specifically a lipid metabolism, to try and see if there were any patterns that stood out among particularly terrestrial Ethereal mammals, and then also looking at humans and comparing these to other systems in diverse environments, and as well as aquatic and marine animals. Moving on from there, I've been pursuing work and trying to reconstruct different ancient microbiome features. I won't say ancient microbiomes themselves. I think it's still kind of an open question as to whether or not a full intact microbiome can actually be preserved and from an ancient context, and depending on the source that you're looking at. But these would be highly degraded, and so likely you're talking about a huge taxonomic and gene representation dropout. And so it's at least in my mind, it will be impossible to fully reconstruct an ancient microbiome, but I think it'd be really interesting to see what kinds of features we can tease out from sources of ancient microbiomes, such as from dental calculus or from coprolites or even from sediment and soil context and other archaeological materials. So that's something I'm kind of actively working on. And from there, I guess my day job is really to experimentally understand the nutritional role of salivary amylase, which is why we tend to have a lot of starch in our diet. We think about starch as also being a prominent source of microbial fermentation, but in fact, of course, we produce the enzymes endogenously that help us break down and ultimately digest and receive energy from starch-containing foods. So in some way, it's all related. It all comes back to diet and nutritional acquisition in humans. But that's what I'm working on right now, and that's what I'm pursuing.
Well, that's quite a bit. Well, what's the way for listeners to find out more about your work and get in contact if they have questions?
Well, okay. I guess I don't maintain so much of an online presence, but I do have a Twitter account that I occasionally post about things that I'm working on or publications that I'll be putting out. It's Twitter, and then my handle would be my last name with a AX at the end, so Schnorr. And I guess anybody could Google me, and I'm, as I said, I have a postdoctoral fellowship that I'm based at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I have an online profile there, and I'm also a visiting research fellow at the Konrad Lorenz Institute in Klosterneuburg in Austria. It's the Center of Advanced Studies in Life and Sustainability Sciences. So I have a very nice online presence there as well, and some descriptions of the projects that I've been working on while I'm here, and also jointly with the University of Nevada with my current postdoctoral fellowship. So I think I'm fairly transparent on the web for anything that I'm doing and currently actively working on.
All right, very good. Well, Stephanie, thanks for coming on the podcast today. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Again, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.